Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm just going to give it another minute in case anyone else is joining off of calls. But while we do a few sort of housekeeping announcements and get ourselves sorted this end, please share in the chat where you are calling in from today. I imagine we have the usual international crowd and we would love to know where you are. I'm tuning in today from my hometown of Norwich in the UK, where it's like 2 degrees, grey and miserable. So somebody please show me that you are using your laptop by a swimming pool or a beach or something. Barbara, I'm just making you co-host, so you have all of the special powers. We have Oda tuning in from Israel. Lovely stuff. We have Leanna from the west coast of Scotland, cold, beach, laptop, Edinburgh, Johannesburg, South Africa, Chiang Mai, Thailand. So we have the usual international crowd going on for these sessions. Great to have you all here. Thank you for tuning in across the various time zones. So I will get started now. Welcome to the first Plumia Speaker Series event of 2022. If this is your first time with us, Plumia is a non-profit mission to build a country on the internet, created by digital nomads and remote workers who believe in the idea of a borderless world. My name is Lauren Razavi. I'm the executive director of Plumia, and I will be your host for the session today. A little bit of housekeeping / GDPR. We will be recording today. In fact, we already are, as Zoom probably told you, and that a very ungraceful way that it does. That means that by turning your video on today, you do agree to being recorded as part of the session. If you'd prefer not to have your face on the internet, you can post questions or comments into the chat box. And without further ado, I'll introduce today's speaker. I'm joined by Parag Khanna, who is an acclaimed futurist and best-selling author known for his books, The Future is Asian and Connectography, amongst many others. He joins us to talk about what digital nomads signal for the future of work, migration, and innovation, and we'll be showcasing some of the ideas from his latest book, Move, The Forces Uprooting Us. So I will spotlight us, Parag, and welcome. Where are you calling in from today?
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you, and I am in Singapore at the moment.
Good stuff. So I guess you've got some good sort of sunshine going on over there.
Sunset almost at this time of day, and apologies for the mess behind me. We've just moved into a new house and I haven't unpacked, and we don't even have Wi-Fi yet.
We'll forgive you, we'll forgive you. Let's start with a brief overview of your books and your background for anyone who is not familiar. What does your work focus on? What do you do at the moment, and how did you get there?
Okay, well, I'll make a long story short so we can dive into the conversation. And by the way, it's just great to see so many faces and geographies, of course. I mean, most fundamentally in my heart of hearts, I'm a geographer and a traveler, and my work has been at the intersection of geopolitics and globalization, which, as I can explain later, I've always viewed as two sides of the same coin rather than as opposing forces. And that was really the theme of my first book called The Second World, which was really about how China, America, and the European Union compete for diplomatic influence around the world. And I told it both as an academic kind of story about geopolitical change, but it was really written as a travelogue. I went to about 45 countries just for that one book and had chapters on each of those countries. That was followed by books that I've done on diplomacy and on infrastructure, and how infrastructure, everything from roads and railways to the internet, reshapes geopolitics and even identity. And that brought me to books that I've written about technology and about governance. And Move is a book that very much is about digital nomads to some degree. They form a very important demographic because it's really a book about the future of human geography through the eyes of young people. I pretty much started from the proposition that today's youth, which includes probably all of you, people under the age of, say, 40, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, represent today 4.5 billion people, which is the majority of the human population. You very often hear people say the world is aging and aging societies are the locus of so many social problems and so forth. That may be true, but if you're genuinely concerned in a utilitarian way about the fate of the human species, you would be focused on youth, and you'd be saying the fate of the world's 4.5 billion people is the single most important thing we can be talking about. And the second most important thing related to that is, where are they going to be? We've identified the who, now where. Why does where matter? Well, not least because of climate change. Because one of the things that you that kind of hits you like a ton of bricks when you look at climate models and then overlay them onto the present demographics of the world and the human geography of the world is that you have declining populations in wealthy northern hemispheric countries that are aging and again that where you have sub-replacement fertility, and you have large and bulging youth populations in geographies that are turning completely red as a result of climate change. So the single most perverse moral fact in the world today, in my view, and I would challenge anyone to come up with anything more perverse than this, is that all of the old and dying people live in the most livable and verdant geographies. And most of the world's young people who have their whole lives ahead of them are trapped in places that are becoming utterly unlivable. And that is something that is entirely of our doing. There is no grand design, there is no supranational organization, there is no United Nations, no COP process, no Joe Biden who's going to get us out of that dilemma, that mismatch, that fundamental misalignment of our human geography and our environmental geography and our political geography and our economic geography. They're completely out of whack. So this book is kind of the culmination of all of the work I've been doing on geography and governance and geopolitics, and saying, what are we going to do about it now? And how are we going to see the results? And again, you see the results through the movements of young people. And that means that means the nomads, among many other populations. So that's how I arrived at this. And it's kind of is a big arc for me. I started out as a youth activist in many ways. Before it was cool to be a youth activist, before Greta Thunberg made it cool. I did a lot of that kind of activism. And I became an academic. I worked, with the U.S. government and other governments around the world. And, I have an advisory firm that works on governance reform and many other kinds of things. But unlike my other books, I really view this one in a missionary kind of way, because it really is about unlocking greater opportunity for all the youth of the world to thrive. And if you are a digital nomad, then you represent the tip of the spear, those with the capacity, those with the talent, those with the connections to be able to live where you want to be. And I really genuinely believe, and it's part of why I wrote the book, that every young person in the world has to or deserves that opportunity, has a right to that opportunity. And literally the fate of our species depends on that.
Fantastic. That was quite the TLDR. I want to pick up, before we get a bit more into nomads, I'd love to just pick up on a point that you made in there, that climate change is really kind of influencing the possibilities and the necessity of global movement in the years ahead. To get down into the weeds of that a little bit, one of my observations when I became involved in this area was how outdated and silly it seems that the United Nations sort of definition of protecting mobility is only within national borders rather than across international borders. I'm curious, do you think that there's scope for those kinds of definitions to change, and for, I guess, an organization like the UN to kind of lead the way on more awareness and more protection of global mobility?
A couple of days ago, I saw someone tweet about the current composition of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva based upon its most recent rotation through the internal voting process. And I noticed that there are countries like Venezuela and Russia and China and Syria and whatnot that make up the current composition of the Human Rights Council. And a lot of people obviously are scratching their heads about that. Now, I use that little story to illustrate whether or not, to shed light on, to answer your question as to whether or not we can rely on the United Nations as an entity to bring us towards the realization of progressive norms. And I dare say that in some of these really cutthroat issues, that's not likely to be the case. Now, the other thing, though, is sovereignty, and this is really, really critical. And, if we were all observing COP26 in Edinburgh, and it's premised really on climate mitigation. What can we do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is, again, existentially important. But what they almost never talk about is adaptation measures. Indeed, at the very, very end of the COP negotiations and in the final declaration, they did slip in through bottom-up pressure, more talk about the need for resources to be devoted to adaptation. And adaptation primarily means migration. What's the shortest way to, how can we best ensure that an at-risk human being, any place in the world, can survive the effects of climate change? Is it to build them a seawall? Is it to deliver them potable water? Or is it to put them on a plane and relocate them someplace safe and stable? Right? The answer is the latter. Now, Lauren, what is the one thing that the member states of the United Nations will never, ever agree on? The governments of the world will agree on how to colonize the moon. They will agree on the norms and codes and standards for everything you can imagine. But never, ever, ever in our lifetimes, in our children's lifetimes, in our grandchildren's lifetimes, if there are to be any, will the governments of the world agree on a common migration accord because of that one word, sovereignty. The reason is we're talking about sovereign governments getting together. Now, governments have lost in many ways, or their sovereignty has been diminished in their control over many things. You can't control pathogens coming across your borders. You can't stop cyber attacks. You can't stop drugs from flowing in. What's the one thing left when all else has been taken away from your government in terms of its raw national sovereignty? The one thing left is to control the movement of human beings across your borders. And that's it. And that's the one thing they'll never give up. So we should never look to the United Nations for progress on this issue. It will not happen. And yet, what did I say at the beginning? I mean, we need to save the human species here. And the one place that we look to as a multilateral organization to guide us is the one place where you should not look. That's part of the dilemma that we're in right now. So this is going to be a bottom-up solution. It's going to be bilateral and regional. It's going to be those Africans relocating within Africa to places that remain livable, those Africans who make it to Europe or elsewhere, those Latin Americans who make it to North America, those South Asians who relocate to Central Asia or to Europe and elsewhere. So all of those vulnerable populations of the world either are going to be stuck where they are, or they're going to move to different places. But there is not going to be, and there will never be, one answer. And that's tragic, but it's also realistic. And we need to start from that common set of assumptions if we're going to come up with realistic solutions rather than utopian ones.
Absolutely. And so let's get into nomads a bit more now. Where do digital nomads kind of fit into what you were just saying there? So I suppose what I'm really asking there is, as a demographic, why are people like us actually in quite a good position to kind of influence policy? And as you put it, kind of save humanity through this kind of cause of global mobility or migration?
Well, so I think we can safely say that digital nomads are a subset of skilled youth. So amongst the 4.5 billion youth, you have the skilled and you have the unskilled. And then you have those with passports with high degrees of access and those without high degrees of access. And then you have communities that seek political change and influence, and those that are just passively, looking for the most convenient, low tax jurisdiction to live in. And there can be overlap across these categories, right? One of the remarkably positive changes during the pandemic has been that instead of just one or two countries having digital nomad policies, and as you very well know better than anyone, literally you are the expert on this, Lauren, right? Digital nomad visa was not a term that anyone heard of before the year 2020, right? Almost nobody. Today, again, as you know, 75, 80, and counting countries have such policies. That is a recognition of how important mobility is and enabling human mobility and attracting digital nomads or skilled youth or any kind of youth to be consumers, taxpayers, tourists, business travelers, residents in your society, because many of our economies are services-based economies. If you don't have people coming in as students or tourists or whatever, your economy goes belly up. And so, the crisis of COVID has this silver lining in educating us on this very important issue that it's better to enable mobility and attract digital nomads and skilled youth than not to have them in your country. I would go so far as to say, and I actually do say this in the book, if you wanted one single metric to predict the success or failure of any society in the world over the next 20 years, I would pick one thing, which is simply this: are they attracting young people today, or are they not attracting young people today? Now, if there are economists in the room, we can come up with 65 criteria, no doubt. I'm happy to talk about currency reserves and innovation levels and all of these kinds of things. Sure, happy to. But again, rule of thumb for, in layman's terms, colloquially articulated, one thing, that's it. If your country's not attracting young people today, you're already in a suicidal mode, right? It could be Venezuela, or it could even be, Bulgaria, right? It can be countries that are first, European Union members. It doesn't have to be, completely isolated geographies and underdeveloped countries. So you need to be attracting young people. Now, why does this matter? Again, from a macro standpoint, let's remember the world population is literally plateauing. Right? 20 years ago, even 15 years ago, if we were having this conversation, there are the sort of conventional wisdom would have been that the world population is going to continue to rise to 50 million people, but in probably 9 billion. Right, which is still a lot of people, but quite frankly, it's not a lot, right? Because it's barely more than we have in the world right now as we speak. So we can deal with 1 billion more people, but then we reach peak humanity. So then everyone will realize, if they don't realize already, that demographics is zero sum. If my country has no children and I'm losing my talented youth to the country next door or across the continent, I'm losing a tax base, I'm losing workers, I'm losing young professionals, I'm in trouble, right? And meanwhile, I have aging people who need to be taken care of, but I have no one to take care of them, and the robots don't do that yet. And I couldn't afford those robots anyway because they're very expensive and come from Japan. So these are real world demographics is becoming zero sum, much, much faster than anyone thought. So again, if your country's not attracting young people. Now, the final point of your questions, I just want to at least touch on, and then I know that it'll be a broader conversation, but you used the word influence. And I think this is so important because the Edelman Trust Barometer came out yesterday. And every year we look at that trust barometer and it tends to give us bad news. Either the public sector is losing respectability amongst the people versus the private sector, or in yesterday's press release talked about how authoritarian countries are more trusted than by their people than democratic countries. Well, here's one of the important things. It's that young people can actually shape the policies of the countries they go to when demographics become zero sum. But the point is that yesterday's trust barometer, the Edelman Trust Barometer for this year, is basically saying young people have lost faith in political systems in democratic societies. However, I want to posit that young people can have a massive influence on politics in those societies or anywhere by virtue of the fact that they can vote with their feet. So you don't build affordable housing, I'm leaving. You don't have free internet access, I'm leaving. You don't lower your tax rate, I'm leaving. You don't have good vocational training opportunities so I can get educated and upskilled, I'm leaving, right? You don't have an LGBT friendly culture, I'm out of here, right? And that is the most powerful vote in the world. It's voting with your feet. It may not have mattered when every country's population was growing and you could say, good riddance, we're producing lots more children and we'll train them to be like us. Guess what? Doesn't work anymore. And so I want the young people, the world, digital nomads, young influencers, whoever you are, to be, cease relentlessly vocal about the progressive demands that you have, because that is precisely how you will get governments to change. When you look at Chile right now, I happen to have been in Chile in the fall of 2019, you had the riots break out over the transit fees and the tuition fees and this kind of thing. And for the first time since the Pinochet regime, they had to bring tanks out in the street and so forth. Now look at Chile. Their new government is led by a very young, coalition cabinet that's totally reforming the constitution and the social welfare system and so forth. That's completely focused on the basic needs and dignity of the next generation. So you can have stories like that. Look at Kazakhstan. Riots have just broken out over inequality and a hike in petrol fees. That's a country that is not a full democracy, but that government is going to learn a lesson. It's going to say, wait a minute, what have we done wrong? We want to fix it right now, because for the last 10 years, they have actually been attracting people. They've been attracting migrants, they've been attracting workers, attracting talent, building themselves into a better, more modern society. They don't want to blow it. They don't want to blow it. There are countries that are blowing it and will continue to blow it, and God help them, right? Like the Venezuelas of the world, places that for everything they do right, they always turn around and also do something wrong. Places like India, where I was born, right? But so I rank and score countries according to that, and I promise you that if you have any faith in humanity, more regimes than not are seeking advice and guidance on how to be a better version of themselves. And that's where youth, your physical presence and your influence comes into play.
Excellent. So I'll sidebar slightly here to just make a recommendation that if anybody is interested in learning more about the global population kind of plateau ahead of us, there's a fantastic, I think, sort of researcher academic, unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but called Hans Rosling. Barbara, maybe you can find a YouTube video and post that in the chat. But he has some fantastic kind of information about what's happening in terms of global population. And I was very surprised, I think, to learn that a lot of the kind of media narratives are just completely false. Like the kind of worry that we can't in fact handle more people in many countries is completely unfounded. Exactly. When you look at the numbers. So do recommend checking that out.
I'll also give a plug, if you don't mind. Hans was someone who was really special to me. I spent a little bit of time with him, and we had a really great kind of connection. So I miss him dearly and was always very inspired by his work.
And his children, I believe, are continuing his work. So very, very good kind of family, very knowledgeable in that area. Do recommend. I know we've got a question already come through in the chat, but Parag, I just want to pick up on nomad visas because they came up in your response to that last question. Do you think that, I guess, mobility tools like nomad visas are going to result in more youth kind of moving around the world? Do you think that will be sort of effective policy, that it's been done right, I guess?
Well, for one thing, it's already happening. I mean, there's a supply and demand equation in terms of the present stock of countries that have nomad visa programs and the number of people taking them up and so forth, and you see a generally positive trend. You also see the criteria relaxing. It is easier to move to the United Kingdom today than it was before Brexit. I mean, that's one of the ironies, one of the many ironies of Brexit that would occupy a whole other conversation. But of course, the UK is experiencing these worker shortages and skill shortages and wants to have students come in and obviously, fill its classrooms. In order to do that, they actually had to relax these criteria. So, that's not under the so-called nomad visa scheme. But many countries are, again, what's really important is the demonstration effect, the copycat effect. When large countries look at each other's immigration policies, they realize, wait a minute, it's better to be Germany than France. Which country is the engine of the European economy? Which country has a growing workforce? Which country now has a stable and popular center-left government that's making it easier to apply for permanent residency and citizenship, right? Germany, not France. When countries look at how they craft their highly skilled migrant programs, guess who nobody looks to? America. Guess who everyone looks to? Canada. In Canada, 95% of the process of applying for residency is digital. In America, it's about 10%, right? In America, it's a bureaucratic shambles. In Canada, it's heroic. They're bringing in 400,000 people every single year, pound for pound. There is no more generous country as a destination for migrants on earth than Canada. And again, you would follow this data very closely. The last couple of years, Canada has topped the United States in these expat rankings and surveys. Again, what are young people looking for? Not just a place that doesn't have Donald Trump as president, but what are places where you have a high number of or a large degree of net new job creation that are full-time jobs, not just gig work, but full-time jobs. And Canada, Germany, Japan are on that list of places where permanent job creation, salary, benefits, and so forth. And again, I think young people are snooping this out and noticing it. So there are many different schemes. In Japan, they don't call it a nomad visa, right? But effectively, they're making it easier and easier for expats from just about anywhere with a certain set of skills to be able to reside in that country. And now, on the sort of upstream side, the parliament has just adopted new legislation that makes it even easier to apply for permanent residency in Japan. Now, again, 5 years ago, if I told you, hey, Lauren, that Nepali construction worker that we saw at the grocery store in Tokyo, he just got permanent residency in Japan, you'd laugh your head off. But guess what? That just happened, right? Now, even lower wage, lower medium skilled workers who have spent enough time in the country and haven't committed any violent criminal offense can become permanent residents. No one would ever have thought that about Japan. I mean, Japan, right? 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, but it's reality today. So there's so many lessons in that, which is that societies are actually way more open than we think they are. I was literally this morning reading some of the latest research on social attitudes in Russia. Russia is another place we think of as culturally insular, maybe even a bit xenophobic and proud and nationalistic. It certainly has a fairly odious strongman president and so forth. And yet, whatever best quality data we have in social research in Russia is telling us that attitudes are actually changing on the ground. And I can tell you for sure from my own experience, I've been to Russia countless times. And in the book, I give stories and quotes. And just more recently in National Geographic, I spelled it out at greater length. Many of the Russians that I speak to actually talk about how they're desperate to have young workers from around Asia and students come in and help them to modernize their economy. In one of the most rapidly depopulating countries on earth, how are they going to get the farmers, the construction workers, the students, and everyone else they need to actually modernize and build Russia for the 21st century? It's not going to happen without people. So whether it goes by the name Nomad visa or whether it's some other kind of soft accommodation and attraction of more migrants, you see it happening everywhere, even in the most unlikely of places. It's not only just the smart countries in the world like Estonia. And as you and I said, there's 75 such countries. Quite frankly, there aren't 75 really smart countries in the world. So it doesn't take a brilliant Singapore-style government to do this kind of thing. It's kind of common sense at some level.
Okay, a reminder, everybody, that if you have questions, you can post them in the chat. In a little while, I will also invite people to unmute and ask their questions to Parag directly if they would like to. For now, though, Liana would like to know, how does voting with your feet work in countries where you still owe taxes as an expat, e.g. the United States? And perhaps before you answer, Parag, I'll just add the detail that I believe it's just 2 countries in the world that have this obligation to pay taxes. It's known as tax nationalism in policy circles. And those 2 countries are the US and Eritrea. So not countries that are sort of brought together in a conversation in this way that often. But yeah, how does it work when you still have obligations to one nation state if you're sort of moving to another?
It's a very specific question for Americans, really, because I obviously know lots of Europeans who are expats and they don't ever have to, other than renewing their passport, they have no obligation or need to remain. And not only that, actually their health insurance actually offers de facto global coverage anyway, by right associated with their citizenship. So they receive all of the benefits of their fellow high tax paying, still domiciled countrymen or countrywomen, but don't have any of the liabilities associated with it. So it's all to the good if you're an EU member living in the UAE or some other low tax country. For Americans, obviously it's different, and there's just a lot of accounting maneuvering that you have to go through in terms of there's tax credits for overseas residents. You don't have to pay your state or city tax, and there's double taxation treaties and these kinds of things. It's basically a lot of money that you have to pay to accountants, to sort this out for you. So it's tricky. It's tricky. I talk about this in the book and the various services that support that dilemma. One of the things that I put together in terms of the data points is the rise of American, both sort of Americans moving abroad, and the number of American expats has more than doubled since just before the financial crisis, which is an enormous number. I mean, it's something that people have paid very little attention to. And the rate of expatriation of Americans, which has also gone up very, very significantly each passing year. So, that's all of that is the generic answer. The rest would all have to be rather specific.
Maybe just to dig into it slightly more, I guess something I'm curious about is your view on whether a policy like that may have to change as countries begin to compete for, in particular, youth around the world. Also, just to add maybe a little bit more color to this, we were talking about in the Plumia Discord the other day, this news story that apparently 30,000 people are waiting to renounce their American citizenship right now. And there have been massive holdups in that system in the United States. So you have folks who've been living in Germany for 10 years and they're ready to take their German passport, but they must sort of renounce their US passport to do that. I bring that up in the context of this conversation because that tax nationalism policy is very much attached to citizenship. And one of the ways that you can, I suppose, sidestep that or no longer have the obligation is to renounce your citizenship. But yeah, very curious, Parag, on your views on what the future policy direction may be there, or in fact, whether there's any hope for change in US government policy on that front.
I mean, it's not handled in a rational manner, because when you're losing 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, if the process were not so over bureaucratized and backlogged, not least as a result of COVID, but also just manpower shortages and processing delays, you would have an even larger run for the exits. And there's a lot of misinformation about how much it costs and how to do it and these kinds of things. But again, the not quite complete cost benefit analysis that the federal government makes is that A, it's just a political capitulation and you don't want to be seen as weak. B, there's a legacy belief that your passport is the most powerful and people would give anything to hold on to it. C, foreigners, expats have no constituency, right? There's no congressional district for expats. So in my case, when we have visiting American Congress people and delegations, the American expats here always go and say, hey, our number one agenda item is repealing overseas taxation. And the Congress people are like, yeah, why don't you vote on it? But of course, your vote as a expat American doesn't really count all that much. It only gets counted if there's like a deadlock or something like that. I don't even know. I haven't voted in the time that I've been abroad. So there's many reasons why it hasn't happened, even though it might be the rational thing, because again, and also the final calculation being, hey, we offset everyone who leaves by hundreds of thousands of new arrivals every single year, which has traditionally been true, right? America, in any given year up until the last couple of years, takes in more migrants who are or become taxpayers than practically the rest of the world put together. Now that has changed dramatically in the last couple of years as a result of Trump and COVID and other things. But actually the US is bouncing back. So there is a set of people around the world, and it's easily, a couple of million people or more, who would gladly pick up on exactly 2 seconds notice and leave all their possessions behind to move to America and become a taxpayer in America, because obviously you're relatively much better off there than in many other places, and they couldn't care less. They'd be proud to be taxpayers in America, right? But it's just a trade-off that has to be calculated. But is there hope? I mean, let me just get to the point. Is there hope for reforming? No, absolutely not. There's no hope.
The only hope is internet countries, not the nation states that we're all used to at the moment, I suppose.
Right.
So there's a strand of anti-immigration thinking that assumes people throughout history have been relatively static and sort of poses that it's a realistic option to simply stop people moving around the world. In a nutshell, what is your response to that argument? Like, is it really possible to stop people moving? And what would be the impact if that were possible?
I mean, I'm not sure why anyone would even think in such a way, since mobility as a concept, as an anatomical, biological reality, is literally intrinsic to what it means to be a human being. So there's a pretty ontological response to such a farcical idea. So I'm kind of like almost scratching my head as to why I would even respond to someone who thinks in that way. But more matter-of-factly, and I think more germane to this conversation, is that actually in every single century, especially the last 5 centuries, the number of people who move and cross borders has been increasing significantly, more than in lockstep with the world population. The decimal point is always moving to the right. So in the 1800s or in the 1700s, millions of people, in the 1800s, tens of millions, in the 1900s, hundreds of millions of people moved across borders. And in this century, it could be 1 billion people or more. So this is about as iron a law of history as you could possibly conjure up in social science, is to say, guess what? As the world population grows, the number of people who physically relocate also grows. And as climate change advances and political disruptions and conflicts occur, widespread, and economic disruptions and technological disruptions, the likelihood that people will be forced to move or will move voluntarily or involuntarily rises significantly. So to argue against that would take, an act of God. And if you could say that COVID was an act of God in some way, which of course it wasn't, but you could make the case that there was this artificial standstill imposed in March, April of 2020, that's kind of where I begin the book. I say, there was this great lockdown, what comes next? And what comes next is the next great migration, because all of human history has been a process of migration. And COVID, whether you're talking about COVID today or the Black Death of 7 centuries ago, people continuously move. And of course, we are resuming patterns, new patterns, some reinforcing old patterns and some new patterns and vectors of mobility constantly. So I don't worry about data being on my side, let's put it that way. I would say 99.9% of all data is in favor of the argument I'm making in this book. So if people are making an argument against immigration, it must be because they want to, right? Because they feel that that would be better. And that's something that I do spend a lot of time on in the book, and saying, let's talk about the weaknesses inherent in nationalist arguments, with primarily that your own country is the greatest loser. And I'm fairly merciless about this in the book. I say, if I confront a right-wing voter or politician in Germany or elsewhere, who comes from a village in a rural area that's relatively homogenous, and they're anti-immigrant, and I would say, look, what you're basically doing is condemning your own parents to die alone. And I'm capable of being that cruel in conversation, because I think they are the ones who are perpetrating the cruelty. Because if you look at the countries, and I'm not sure this is the kind of macabre research that a lot of people would do, but if you look at countries where elderly people are literally found dead, alone, their corpses rotting. This is not the conversation you thought you were going to have, nor did I, but it's factually true. If you look at the countries where elderly people are left to die in a thoroughly undignified manner, well, that tends to overlap with places that are not immigrant friendly. And I find that utterly dehumanizing. Not only that, I find it reprehensible morally, and I find it barbaric. Now, if you want to live in a civilized society and call yourself a civilized society, you would be a place that cares for its elderly. And the way you care for your elderly is by having young people who are nurses and caregivers and assistants working, and being assigned to work with elderly people in hospices and homes. And if your country is not doing that, I dare say you've fallen from grace pretty substantially. So, that's the kind of that and 25 other arguments I make about the self-destructive, self-defeating nature of xenophobic, populist, nationalist politics. I'll just give you one other example because we may have some Italians on the call, or residents of Italy, but I go to some length to dismantle the cult of Matteo Salvini, in this book, because when he was popular and he was talking about his family-centric social policy and so forth, it was his, polite way or not so veiled way of saying women should sit home and have babies, and then we'll have a healthy society again. And guess what? You can correlate that to. You can correlate his every statement to an uptick in the number of Italian women who leave Italy. Well, how did that work out for you, Matteo? Right? Not so well. And so I think that, you really, again, I can go on and on and on and on about all of the ways in which, nationalism, we view as political, especially in my field of political science, we herald it, we put it on a pedestal. It's this immutable principle of national identity, and nationalists are back and so forth. All I see is nationalist societies failing. And populist governments, failing at every turn and losing at the next election. So why we get so obsessed about Viktor Orban is really just one of these never-ending mysteries for me. If you were to do a Google search or count up the Google hits that Viktor Orban has gotten, even in the English language press, in the last 5 years, it would probably exceed those hits of Justin Trudeau, which again is a head scratcher, because not only is Canada significantly more important a country, but it's obviously the polar opposite story when it comes to immigration. So I'll just chalk that up to the media being the media, and covering what gets clickbait rather than what makes any sense and what actually represents human behavior and policy behavior. And again, the German election, 5 years ago, it was all about how the AfD party was on the rise because Merkel let more than 1 million Arab refugees in. Well, where is the AfD party today? Exactly nowhere. Exactly where they belong, nowhere. And exactly what you could have predicted several years ago, because populists don't know how to run a country. And that's something that I do observe very, very matter-of-factly, in my field.
Okay, so we very much touched on the failures of international institutions and nation states in our conversation so far. So I want to turn the conversation now towards internet countries, which is the kind of project that has brought our community together. So Plumia aims to build a country on the internet for digital nomads. What do you think about that idea of an internet country? And in a world of remote work, is it an idea whose time has come?
Absolutely. I think the idea, let me just go back a few years. When I started in connectography, I talk about the five C's, the 5 types of entities that are competing in the marketplace for identity and agency and authority in the world. Countries, such as we know them, states; commonwealths, by which I meant regional groupings like the EU; companies, sort of speaks for itself. But within companies, there are those that are truly stateless versus those that are more rooted. Cities that operate, and struggle for devolutionary power within their federal systems, but also that act as global nodes and in many ways have greater power and gravity in the global system than many countries do. So I talk about, how whether it's New York City or whether it's London or whether it's Lagos, Nigeria. Lagos, for example, is really the capital of all of West Africa. It's not technically, legally, it's not even the capital of Nigeria, but functionally, it's the most important city for a gigantic swath of Africa, if not all of Africa. So, and then the final C is communities. And in that, I put everything from diaspora groups to internet-based cloud communities. And that's where you fit in. And that's a very important C, one very important entity. It's certainly growing in number and in the number of people who have those affinities and share an identity with other people who they've never met. It's also growing in internal coordination capacity as a result of technological platforms that can operate in semi-autonomous ways, whether it's blockchain, Web3, whatever the case may be, or obviously cryptocurrencies as well. And they're exerting greater agency, right? The ability to shape the behavior of traditional states or other entities, and to cut deals with them in order to have stable geographical anchors. So that is why I think what you do is so important, because it fits into this much broader paradigm of systems change in the world, and systems change, the kind that we are quite frankly fortunate to be living through right now. It's so exhilarating to be living through right now, the kind of systems change that the international order has not experienced for centuries. We get to be on that roller coaster right now. And what you're doing is basically seat 1A and seat 1B of that fast-paced, loop-de-loop roller coaster. I was taking my kids on those roller coasters this weekend, so it's kind of like fresh in my mind, that kind of analogy. And that's where we are. And there is no answer. There's no playbook for how it's gonna play out, what the end state is going to be. But I know that you're at the cutting edge of those cloud communities that are shaping the global system, and that have a long runway to do so because you're young. B, have an accelerated pathway to influence because you embrace technology rather than fighting against it. And C, you represent not only numerically a growing number of people, but the capital that they can accumulate. And that capital can be technical know-how as well as financial capital. And when you put those together, it still need not result in a physical instantiation of forming a new sovereign geographical territory, but the ability to shape existing territories, apropos what we were saying earlier, or to innovate something completely novel, such as you're doing, is more kind of robust than ever before. So that is kind of the underlying logic to why I think this work is so important.
I can already tell we're going to have to invite you back, Parag, to really get into it on the internet country front. But for now, I just want to remind everyone, if you do have questions you'd like to ask Parag, you can use the raise your hand functionality. You can post the questions in the chat, or you can post in the chat saying that you'd like to speak. Very, very happy to take some questions in that way. But perhaps while we give people a minute to think if they have questions, I'm going to get my copy of Move from my bookshelf here. And just, this is Parag's latest book, Move. Oh, Liana's got a copy as well. And we are going to give away a few copies of this on today's call. So if you are interested in receiving a copy of Move, if you haven't read it yet, we are going to give away 3 copies, and I think we'll organize that. Sorry, Parag, this is the first time we've ever done a giveaway, so we don't have a process yet. But I guess if you are interested in having a copy of the book, maybe raise your hand, not physically if your camera's not on, but using the functionality here in Zoom. So we have 1 raised hand so far. Fantastic. I think you can have one, John T, for speed. And we have Gordon as well. Fantastic. Okay, so we have 1 more. Speak now or forever hold your peace, chats. We have, oh no, everyone did it at once now. Okay, we're gonna make sure that this process is a bit smoother in future, but we'll give away these copies to John T and Gordon, and Nikki was the next one that I saw. Folks, please send me a message on Discord if you're already part of the community. I am Elraz over there, or you can email elraz@plumia.country, and we will sort out getting your copies of the books over.
For sure, happy to support that and send them over.
Thank you very, very much, Parag. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, we can now cover those off. So yeah, oh, do we have? Yes, we do. Okay. So Nikki would like to know, how do you see the global education system / framework developing to support the nomad family movement?
This is fascinating, and it's something that I've really lived through and could write a whole book just about this, but I'm pleased to see that there's a number of startups that have come into play that are really helping to facilitate movement for young families. I only put one paragraph about this in the book, though it's quite frankly the logistics of my life of the last 10 years is literally this question, is like how to move around with the young kids. And the funny thing is, let me just give one sociological point that fits into the broader framework here. If you think about it, if there are fewer and fewer children in the world, then people who do have children actually want to live in places where other families have children. And there isn't really one like concierge that sorts that out for you. But now there are a couple of companies that are doing that. And one of the things that we've found as we move around for sabbaticals, in different places around the world, is that but at this point, every service has become a commodity. Like you used to have to go and get new SIM cards, but in order to do that, you have to have a rental contract, and and now you just stay on WhatsApp and you don't change your SIM card, and you rent your place online through Airbnb before you even show up. And what we found is that the only thing left that makes moving, that requires within a move to do any advanced planning at all, is your children's education. Right. So one thing that has like a long runway, and we would apply like 9 months in advance, like we were in Berlin a couple of years ago, and it was like, oh, we're going to school and like this school and that school, put in different applications and letters of recommendation and all this stuff. And it prohibits you from acting on the fly. And so we find that that's literally the one hurdle remaining in the world. And obviously when you have kids, I can tell you, for those who don't, like, and those who do can sympathize, but Zoom, kids and Zoom for 6 hours a day is not a good way for children to spend their time. It's literally unhealthy. It's the best you can do. It's better than not being in school at all, but it's not optimal. So kids need other kids. So people will look for places where, and again, that's where these startups come in. They're saying, where are places where young families want to go, where they want to settle, where they want to spend time? What are the educational opportunities? How are they structured for different age groups, and what curricula and so forth? And I see that as a really vibrant area in terms of bringing families together and providing educational opportunities, whether it's daycare or Montessori or baccalaureate curricula, mix of in-person and hybrid, maybe even having chapters of the kind of same school in different places so you could move even within a given year. That's an area that's ripe for greater innovation and investment and certification, so that it becomes seamless. And then it resolves that one last remaining kind of logistical hassle around being a nomadic family. So again, about 10 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, there was very, very little facilitation, let's say, in this space. And now I already, can think of 3 or 4 companies that are doing it. So I think that's good news.
Excellent. So I can see Gordon and Oded still have their hands raised. Gordon, do you have a question that you'd like to ask Parag? Feel free to unmute and ask if you do, or unraise your hand if you don't, and we'll pretend this moment didn't happen.
Yeah, well, to be frank, I didn't really have a question, but now that you asked me, I'll come up with a question. So far he hasn't talked at all actually about do you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So far he hasn't talked at all about cryptocurrency and money, and he also hasn't talked about unemployment really. And now I'm not saying that really has that much to do with his move topic, but those are topics that interest me. And since he knows a lot and has moved around a lot, and it at least has a little bit to do with migration, I figure I'll ask this question. Do you think that the monetary system, the way it currently is designed, is going to work in a world where that, according to some analysts, is in some parts of the world at least headed towards hyper unemployment?
Well, I don't think that
I'm asking this. I was in Congo recently. And the people out there told me that they have like an unemployment rate of like 90% plus.
well, let's break it down in a couple of things. Just in terms of employment, unemployment, I think I briefly mentioned that the countries that offer the highest growth in permanent salary jobs with benefits are places that are also rising in the expat kind of preference rankings and are attracting young people. And specifically, those countries at the top of that list are Germany, Canada, and Japan. So we have real economic data that's telling us that not only is it a good place to move if you're just kind of in the gig economy, it's a good place to move if you have the kind of skills that are employable in a fixed salaried position. It could be being a management consultant or a lawyer or a doctor or whatever the case may be. But if you are looking for a permanent job with benefits, then, again, we can rank countries according to creation of jobs like that. Unemployment, on the other end, where there's high unemployment, they're obviously not as likely to attract people because, again, it means that there's weakness in the economy, the labor market, there's a lot of competition for jobs in the labor market, or your skills may not even be needed in that country. There are many reasons or many sort of, reasons why you could have high unemployment in a country. And of course, it could be a place like the Congo where most of the economic activities in the informal sector rather than the formal sector. And it hasn't been formalized, whether through enlarging the tax base or digital apps and services and this kind of thing, the way you see happening in Indonesia. Like in Indonesia is a $1 trillion economy, but 45% of it is estimated to be in the informal sector. So just people working for each other peer-to-peer for cash. But now that you have an app like Gojek, if you haven't heard of Gojek, Gojek has merged with Tokopedia and it's become, some several $100 billion value company. It represents several percent of the GDP of one of Asia's largest economies. It's just that one company. And when young people or anyone gets on Gojek, whether it's to sell an artisanal craft that they've made or to take you for a ride like a taxi, like Uber, it all gets recorded on that app. And then taxes can be levied on it and the state benefits and you get a stronger state as a result. So you can bring down informal unemployment through technology, and I think that's a good thing. And there's a relevance to crypto in the sense that a lot of these apps also pay in their own internal currencies, or you accrue points within those ecosystems, or you can spend that currency within the entire e-commerce environment of those super apps, whether it's WeChat in China or Gojek in Indonesia or the like. More broadly, internationally on cryptocurrencies, of course, I think they play a very significant role, again, in an evolutionary way. A lot of examples that people cite tend to just be around the secure shifting of assets internationally in order to evade taxes and to do so in anonymous or pseudonymous ways. There is that, but I also view it more broadly as part of the competition around regulation and the competition to provide that service of money, that function of credit to the billions of people who are underbanked in the world. And in that sense, the rise of cryptocurrencies is definitely responding to a market failure. Not enough people have access to either the US dollar or the rupiah or the rupee or the dinar or whatever currency. And if they can have that credit through a digital instrument, and if it's actually sufficiently fungible to use, you can buy something with it, you can lend onward with it, you can pay someone with it, then you have generated useful economic activity out of a cryptocurrency. So of course, I think that's a positive thing. It's part of the evolution of the global monetary system, and it's too soon to say, though, whether or not it will replace the dollar or that kind of debate. That's a whole separate conversation that we can have, but it's not really relevant here. I mean, I do talk about this in the book. I say that in a world of cryptocurrencies, digital nomadism is enabled even further because, of course, you no longer need to close your bank account, shut it down, withdraw all the cash in that currency, move across borders, declare it that you've exited with that money, declare that you've arrived with that cash into a new government, into a new country, and open up a new bank account, right? You've just cut out 20 pretty unnecessary steps. in a world where you have fungible cryptocurrencies that you can actually use inside the borders of different societies that are accepted as legal tender and different kinds of entities. So, I think we're at very early stages of that, and I think it's very promising. And I think it is built into the logic of young digital nomads today that becomes one of the factors that you look at alongside whether it's safe, whether the schools are good, whether the rent is affordable, and other kinds of things. When you're deciding where to go, whether or not they function in or allow your preferred cryptocurrency. So I think it's a great question. I think we're the answers are emerging as countries experiment with those policies.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question, Gordon, and thank you for that thorough response, Parag. We are at time now, so we will leave it there. I just want to mention our next Plumia Speaker Series event is on the 2nd of February, and I will be joined by Caroline Hendricks, who was involved with the creation of Estonia's digital nomad visa. So please join us for that one. You can find details of all of our events that have been announced and that are being announced in future on the Luma page. That's lu.ma/Plumia-series, I believe. So please join us over there. Parag, thank you so much. This conversation has been fascinating, and I hope we can bring you back again soon.
I'd love to, and don't miss Carly. She's a hero in our household. She's one of my daughter's mentors. And a good family friend. So don't miss that one.
Wow, it's such a small world once you have the internet, hey.
Or when you travel, as all of you do. So remember, don't just be a digital nomad, please also be a physical nomad, and make sure you're changing location and exploring the world.
Thank you so much. See you, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Back again
Bye-bye.
soon. Bye.